gentlemen, we would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development.
So, before we
NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The Institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
But thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is connecting Nepal to the world with the aim to bring leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all over the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goal. This is the 10th session of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it is a real pleasure to have with us Ambassador Gyan Acharya. Ambassador Gyan Acharya served as the UN Under-Secretary General and High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. He was also a member of the United Nations Senior Management Group and the High-Level Task Force for Global Food Security, as well as a Commissioner of the High-Level Broadband Commission for Sustainable Digital Development. He has also served on the advisory board of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, co-chaired by the UN Secretary General and the President of the World Bank. Ambassador Acharya was Foreign Secretary with the Government of Nepal, Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization in Geneva, spokesman of the Foreign Ministry and Joint Secretary responsible for South Asia, Europe, Americas, and regional organizations, economic relations, and coordination divisions. Without any further ado, I request the chair to take over.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your generous introduction. I would like to also begin by thanking NICE and Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and his team for organizing this webinar. And let me also extend a warm welcome to all the distinguished participants. I think we are privileged to have a whole galaxy, I should say, of the experts, diplomats, as well as from academia. I think this is a very important speakers that we have today. And I think this will, I hope that the time that we have will give us some idea to scratch probably a little bit of a surface, because the issue of rise of Asia is so big that I think we cannot get into the details within the time that is made available to us. Therefore, all distinguished speakers may make their observation for 10 to probably 12 minutes or so in the beginning, and then there will be a follow-up discussions and questions and answers. Now, let me try to initiate the conversations. First, our topic, the rise of Asia. Some experts say that Asia has already risen because of its economic, commercial, military, and strategic heft. Others say that we have yet to see how the rise of Asia will change the world order. So the question is, how do we take the rise of Asia and its impact globally? Will it be a rebalancing of the current world order, or are we going back to the balance of power world of the Europeans in the past, or something totally different? What could be the contours of such relationship? What is the role of the current multilateral principles and institutions, especially the United Nations? And probably my second point is, how do we analyze the major power centers of Asia, China, India, Japan, and other powers, whether country poles or even the regional poles in terms of their relationship with each other and with the global power, especially United States, which has a huge presence in the region. Among them, the relationship between China and India, the emerging and the aspiring superpowers, will be the most important one, or in fact, a defining one in terms of the Asian geopolitical landscape, but also by implications, of course, the global political landscape. So how do you see the relationship going forward, especially now between them? And how do we assess BRI, RCEP, CPTPP, and also recent developments of even Quad, and the announcement of, I should say, a number of the specific policies that have been made towards this region, and which has been relentlessly announced by the major powers of late. So my third point is the recent G7 and NATO meetings and their outcomes. Is a new Washington consensus being developed, or what is it that we should be looking at? And then finally, probably, of course, can we define a collective Asia, or should we look at Asia as perhaps the amalgamation of different regions or power centers? And then how are we going to analyze the collective then? And what does it mean for smaller states or those with limited attributes of power in terms of their relationship with the competing major powers? So these are some of my inquiries, but of course, the speakers themselves can also focus on a number of other issues that they consider important. But let us start our session. Let me begin with Professor S.D. Muni, former ambassador, as well as the Professor Emeritus at JNU, a veteran analyst of and expert on India's neighborhood policies. He has written so many books and commented quite extensively on these issues. So I give the mic to you, sir.
Thank you, Sri Acharya. Thank you very much. I thank Pramod for upgrading me to this very eminent panel where I don't really belong. But it's a great pleasure to be with old friends and many colleagues. The subject before us is Asia's rise. And when we look at Asia's rise, to my mind comes two Asias, not one. One Asia is the Asia confined with Indo-Pacific. The other Asia is the Asia confined to West Asia and Central Asia. While one Asia is rising on the Indo-Pacific side, the other Asia is in great turbulence. And this turbulence has a huge spillover in other part of Asia, that is the Indo-Pacific Asia, flagged by, I will not go into details because we don't have time, in terms of their control over energy resources, particularly hydrocarbons, oils. Secondly, due to the religious radicalization which flows from West Asia and gets supported by West Asia. And thirdly, by regulating the what you call the migrant population from the Indo-Pacific Asia, which goes and works in West Asia. Therefore, West and Central Asia, though are not taken into reckoning while talking about Asia's rise, I would say that we must keep it at the back of our mind of the spillovers and implications of the kind of turbulence which is going on over there, because it will call for investment in policy, time, resources, everything in order to see if Asia is stabilized. Now, coming to Indo-Pacific Asia, there is no doubt that China has risen phenomenally. And I think there is no parallel to the way China has risen. But China is not the only country which has risen. There are many other Asian countries which are rising. It is true that the recent pandemic has given a great setback to countries like India in their rise. But there are all calculations available with us which will show that these countries will come out of the pandemic and will resume their growth trajectory in a manner that they had been carrying it out earlier. There are countries like Vietnam, there are countries like Bangladesh. I mean, it's a very, very impressive record, which Bangladesh has suggested to other. You can also consider Korea, Taiwan, and all said and done ASEAN, which is a group of countries, but they have tremendous promise and tremendous dynamism so far as rise is concerned. So this rise, I think, would continue. And with the economic growth, the countries are acquiring military capabilities, scientific and technological capabilities, and trying to manage their efforts in one way or the other. Now, with this rise all around in the Indo-Pacific Asia, I think people have been mentioning, the countries, leaders, scholars have been mentioning about the Asian century. Now, whether it will be an Asian century or not, when we talk of Asian century, let us keep it in mind. If at all it becomes an Asian century, it would be the second time that it would be an Asian century, because often we forget the earlier period from 1st to 18th century when China, India, and Asia was dominating the world, both commercially, economically, and civilizationally. It is unfortunate that Asian scholars, largely because of imperialism, colonialism, have not been able to focus enough attention on the character of that Asian centuries and how the Asians governed themselves, how they grew themselves. I think it calls for a kind of an academic challenge or a policy challenge to analyze how Asian relations shaped themselves at that time. The perspective or the prospects of Asian century in the Indo-Pacific have been seriously challenged by the most, I say, most robust riser, which is China. And that is largely due to its assertion and aggression, which has raised serious questions about Asian century. That look, I mean, if Asia has to be recorded a new century influencing the whole world, there is a lot which China may have to be doing, and I'll come to it in a short while and conclude there. But we must remember, keep it in mind, that any Asian century will have to be will have to create a multipolar Asia. It cannot be a unipolar Asia where one country, unfortunately, all through the Cold War years, even during the colonial and imperial period, we had seen some kind of a unipolar Asia, one major powerful country dominating Asia. US dominated Asia for all the past maybe say 30, 40, 50 years. Now that is not possible if Asia is rising. As China says that it will not accept any other domination, China must also realize that any other rising Asian country will also not accept domination. And therefore, we will have to have what you call a multipolar Asia, where the Asian majors, now this multipolar Asia, we still have to work out the kind of a governance system of the Indo-Pacific Asian region, how it will then be governed. But to my mind, it will have to be consensual. And one consensual model is presented to us by ASEAN, where different sizes of countries really participate with conflict, not the governing idea, but cooperation and engagement being the governing idea. So ASEAN model may be one of them, but we can seek other models also. And I think amongst the other models can be a federal model, where you have separate clusters of the countries and they collaborate and cooperate with each other. Well, this is just an idea, I'm flagging it, that in the federal governance, the major players and their clusters would actually decide the shape and contours of the strategic and economic aspects of Asia. The greatest responsibility, and this is my last point because I said I don't want to take much time, the greatest responsibility for pushing Asia or encouraging Asia or facilitating Asia towards an Asian century lies with China. And I think one of the major areas where China has to work is to resolve its conflicts and disputes with its immediate neighbors. Particularly in South China Sea, whole of ASEAN is disturbed about it. With regard to India, with regard to Japan, all these problems, if they continue to linger on, please forget about the dream of the Asian century, because that presents a fragmented Asia which is really operating. Now, for this, China claims that it has resolved its border disputes with so many countries. So then why leave it with some of these countries at all? And again, I don't have time to go into that. China makes promises, we will do this, and then does not carry out those promises. So one, it has to resolve its differences and its conflicts with the neighbors. It has to assure the rest of Asia that it will follow norms and it would not put in constraints in terms of movement and freedom, which is given by the global consensus. Then it will also keep the common spaces open. I mean, in South China Sea, for instance, how can China say that you will not have this area as a fly zone, you will not come into this area in one way or the other? And lastly, I think China will have to demonstrate that its economic engagement with the rest of Asia, which is very robust, very vigorous, will have to be based on mutual benefit. It cannot be based on unilateralism, whether it is a question of trade or whether it is a question of advantages which accrue out of it. It will have to share prosperity rather than exploit the resources all over in order to build its own prosperity single-mindedly. I think these are some of the parameters. There is an articulation by President Xi and some of the Chinese leaders to say that this is all we intend to do. Unfortunately, this articulation has got to be seen on the ground in terms of reality. And if that is translated into reality, probably we would have made some steps forward towards creating an Asian century. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor S. D. Muni, for really taking up a number of issues, Asia, Pacific, and West Asia, and the second Asian century, multipolar Asia, and the role of China, and then, of course, the action on the ground. I think they're very important presentation. So I thank you for that. Now I would like to invite Mr. Shivshankar Menon, my good friend, who was Ambassador, Foreign Secretary, National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. He's currently teaching at the university as well, besides many other engagements. I must mention his most recent book is India and the Asian Geopolitics, which has been widely acclaimed. Now you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acharya. It's good of you to give me that flattering introduction. I don't want to repeat what we all know about Asia's rise. I mean, many of these things have become truisms in the last decade or so. About India, about Asia's tremendous economic growth, the political centrality that growth has brought to us. Instead, what I'd like to do is to make a few points about the geopolitical effects of the manner in which Asia, or at least South, Southeast, and Northeast Asia have grown and developed, and then to draw a few conclusions. It seems to me that there have been four main geopolitical effects of the manner in which Asia has risen in the last decade or so. One is, of course, obviously the shifts in the balance of power. The world's center of gravity is back in Asia after 2 centuries when it wasn't. There's been a clear shift in the balance of power. The center of gravity of the world economy, of politics, is also back in Asia. And in a process which actually started long ago. I mean, we all look at only the present, but started with Japan, followed by the Asian tigers. And basically, most of these countries which have done this followed the same pattern that Japan established of industrialization, export-led growth, and in huge investments in human capital. The central fault line of global geopolitics is today in Asia. But it's between China and the US. It's a pushback by the established powers against the rise. And so it's not only a pushback against China, it's against a change in the order. And the world is therefore today, to try and answer the chair's question at the beginning, to my mind, we are between orders today. I mean, the old US-led Western order is no longer capable of dealing with the issues that we face, clearly. But there isn't a new order to replace it. Whether we call it Asian century or whatever, still doesn't exist. The US today works to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor, which she sees in China, and competes in the economic, technological, military fields for power and influence. China, for its part, seeks a primacy that her version of history tells her she enjoyed before the so-called century of humiliation. Or as she puts it, she wishes to take center stage again. Of course, as Professor Muni reminded us, and the chair reminded us, the rise of Asia has been uneven. To the east of the subcontinent, we see strong Westphalian states with dynamic economies, while to the west, we see multiple non-state actors, outside powers, influential. And economic growth is not much less evident. And our subcontinent, India, Nepal, we are all on the cusp between these two differing development pathways and political trajectories. And our security is affected by both, by terrorism, the effects of disorder to our west, and by the growing geopolitical friction, uncertainty, and contention between states to our east. And in both cases, east and west, the overall effect of the rapid changes in the balance of power is that all the flashpoints and hotspots across the region are now live. From the East China Sea, Japan, China, the Diaoyu, Senkaku, to Taiwan, to the South China Sea, to the India-China border, to Yemen, to Syria. I mean, you can go on. The list is just whether it's Israel, Iran, etc. Second big geopolitical consequence has been the rise of authoritarian leaders and the consolidation of state power in some of the major powers. Because the manner in which growth took place, because it was highly uneven and unequal in its distribution of benefits, both between and within states. Within states, inequality has generated internal political and social stress in perceived threats to identity, polarization, and in several significant states, large ones. These stresses have resulted in the rise of authoritarian leaders who promise to deal with the uncertainty by centralizing power. Their rise is accompanied by strongman personality cults, by a strong appeal to nationalism, ultranationalism for legitimacy. None of this would matter. Frankly, this would be everybody's internal affair, except that it reduces their ability to negotiate, to bargain, to undertake the compromises and the give and take that diplomacy requires for the peaceful resolution of disputes and issues. Thirdly, we now have a new security agenda, thanks to globalization and its effects, but also thanks to technology, primarily ICT. And these are transnational. So while politics has become increasingly local, internal politics, the security agenda has become transnational and requires multilateral solutions. It requires many countries to work together. You look at climate change, you look at pandemics. I mean, you saw during COVID, cybersecurity, international terrorism, maritime security. These are not issues that any one country or even small groups of countries can deal with. So for me, therefore, the risk of a single power centered sort of order emerging out of this are really almost very low, because no single power can deal with these issues, with the big issues of the day. And the COVID pandemic has also shown us that the existing multilateral institutions are less than effective. I mean, whether it doesn't matter which one, you look at G20, G7, UN, WHO, Security Council, what do they do to deal with COVID? And we're all struggling on our own, basically, every country. In fact, we've seen the opposite. We've seen a rise in vaccine nationalism and other such phenomena which postpone solving problems. Fourthly, and this is really for us, one result of the heightened geopolitical contention and the fact that the central political contest between the US and China is being played out in Asia is that South Asia has increased significance. South Asia was a sideshow during the Cold War, no longer. The subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region matter today. This is also because we have done relatively well in economic terms over the last 3 decades or so. And it's also because we are located where we are. I mean, some of it is our doing. Some have done even better than others. Bangladesh is a very good example, as Professor Muni reminded us. Today, for instance, Nepal is courted by both the US and China for the free and open Indo-Pacific and for the Belt and Road Initiative, respectively. Tibet has become a sensitive issue again. What's true of Nepal is true of other countries in the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region as well. So, 2 quick sort of final points. What COVID did was not to change all these trends, but accelerate them all. All these trends were visible before 2020, but the pandemic has lowered economic expectations, heightened contestation among the powers, has sharpened China-US contention, has seen authoritarian leaders centralizing power, and has made the new security agenda even more critical. If anything, these trends have become stronger. COVID has also turned most countries inwards towards, in India's case, Atmanirbharta, self-reliance, China, dual circulation economy, the US building back better, just when we need international solutions to these problems. Secondly, the unevenness of Asia's rise means that over 50% of Asia's GDP, excluding Japan, and 30% of world economic growth in 2019, the year before the pandemic, came from 2 countries, India and China. We all have an interest in both these countries succeeding and in both of them managing their relationship well. It's in no one's interest that the larger powers and the drivers of growth fail, become angry, frustrated countries. And I think we should remember that when we play political games among ourselves. All in all, we're in the midst of a recalibration of geopolitics and the global economy, marked by, as I said, great power competition with no end in sight. So to my mind, Asia has risen, but has yet to find its own equilibrium, both in the world and within itself. Asia could continue to rise because it has, the economic fundamentals are strong, as is its relative and comparative advantage in political terms also. But whether it will continue to do so depends on it handling the geopolitics as well as it did the economics during the globalization decades. And that is an open question. I'll stop there and leave it to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shivshankar Menon, for highlighting a number of points. I think I really liked when you said center of gravity has now shifted to Asia. South Asia is on the cusp. And then, of course, we are seeing both the geopolitical friction as well as the non-state and terrorism actors. And then, of course, there is no single power. We are in the midst of the new order, and the recalibration of Asia has to find equilibrium both outside Asia as well as in Asia. I think those are very, very important issues and many other important issues that we will come back to that. Now, I would like to invite Mr. MC Raja Mohan. He's another well-known academic, journalist, and foreign policy analyst. He's currently the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. He has to his credit many acclaimed books on foreign policy. So another good friend, Mr. Raja Mohan.
Thank you, Ambassador Acharya. Nice to see you here. And I want to thank NICE for inviting me to be part of this event and this panel in particular. So what I do is try and make 3 sets of interrelated points in the few minutes that I have. The first point I'd like to make would be about unpacking or disaggregating the notion of Asia's rise The previous speakers have touched on it, but I want to go into a little more detail on that. Second, associated with the notion of Asia itself and the Asia's rise is the idea of Asian unity that we ought to construct or we can construct. That has been a long-standing notion. So I want to just explore its prospects at this juncture. And third, to look at the presumed tension between Asia and the West. For more than 100 years, these two concepts were seen as in opposition to each other, but I want to just get into that and see how that might play out. First, on Asia's rise, I mean, what seems a fairly simple, straightforward proposition of the economic transformation of our part of the world. But the moment you get a little deeper into it, I mean, I think it reveals a lot more complexity. As Professor Muni said, look, we don't even, there are many Asias, and the actual definition of Asia has never been settled. And whenever I meet my friends from the Gulf who come to Singapore often, they say, this is my first time in Asia. So the Gulf and the Middle East don't see themselves as part of Asia, although we like to call them West Asia. So when we talk about rise of Asia, really, we're talking about rise of East Asia in that sense. The second aspect is this idea was always been was not just about stating facts, but it had ideas or ideologies associated with the notion of Asia's rise and what its meaning ought to be. So in this question, I mean, I think I would say one, as Ambassador Menon pointed out, Asia did not rise all at one time. I mean, it's been a sequential rise. Japan first, more than almost a century ago, and then you had the Asian tigers, then you have the ASEAN, then China, and then India. Even more interesting, I think, is the fact that that Asia's rise does not mean it is all risen to the same level. That is, any disaggregation of the economic power or the other stuff that you take a look at Asia today, it shows that, look, China's rise has overshadowed the rise of rest of Asia. And we're only talking about East Asia here. For example, on GDP, China's GDP today, around $15–16 trillion, is almost 3 times bigger than Japan's. And China's GDP of $16 trillion is almost more than 5 times bigger than India's, which is around $3 trillion. And these are two of China's largest neighbors. So that tells you the scale of difference. So when we talk about China's rise, it's easy to miss that China has risen faster than the rest of Asia. Rest of Asia has risen too, but China has risen faster than rest of Asia. And that sets up, I think, a context in which China is going to be far more powerful than its neighbors. And I think that will have consequences of its own. And I think that brings me to the second point. But we must be clear that we should not conflate Asia's rise and China's rise. And these are both are facts, but I think we need to look at this as two different phenomena, because one has huge consequences for the other, because the simple association as if Asia has risen without reference to its internal distribution of power, I think will take us in a wrong way. The second, I think, is the notion of Asian unity, which has always been there for more than a century. The very discovery of the notion of Asia, or the propagation of the notion of Asia. Okakura Tenshin, who wrote in 1903, The Ideals of the East, his book began with a brilliant first sentence. That's how anybody who writes books hopefully can find such sentence. It's simply a 3-word sentence. Asia is one. Asia is one. It was more of an idea that Asia was not really one at that point in time, but the idea that, look, there is something common binding the whole of Asia. At least Tenshin was writing about the cultural dynamic. Therefore, we need to think of this region as a single. And I think after that, we've seen extraordinary surge of Pan-Asianism across the region in the interwar period. And the notion that, look, Asia must come together to deal with the West, to deal with the colonial powers. And that if we go back, Ambassador Menon would be familiar with the first declaration between an Indian delegation and the Chinese delegation in the Brussels Anti-Imperial Congress in 1927, lays out a framework that, look, we are going to inherit the world, we are going to get together to transform the world as we gain independence from our colonial powers. But the idea of Asian unity was as elusive as it was appealing. Because we talked about an international congress and the Chinese delegation doing it in 1927, but barely 10 years later, they could not agree on how to deal with the Second World War. Because the Chinese were fighting the Japanese, and the Indian National Congress said we must fight the British, although the Indian army was mobilized. But the fact is, Indian National Congress would not extend support to Chinese demand that, look, we should work together first let's do the Japs first and we'll do the Brits later. That was not the strategy of the Indian National Congress, which got into a Quit India movement. So this notion that, look, somehow we can work together just because we are Asians. I think the World War II is such a classic example that already risen power in Asia, that is Japan, made life complicated. Japan was also imperial. And I think that led to all kinds of complications in Asia. And I think that reminds us, it should constantly remind us, one thing to talk about Asia as one, it's another to build actual unity. And for all the romanticization we've done in Delhi about the Asian Relations Conference and the Bandung Conference of 1955, any closer look at the discussion there would show you the deep divisions within Asia at that point of time. And those divisions have not really gone away. And my sense is the ASEAN's rise, if you will, and the absence of great power rivalry in the last couple of decades and an economic integration created, I think, in retrospect, we can say the illusion that Asia is now coming together into a single format. But as China has risen, I think that its aspirations, its ambitions, which Ambassador Menon referred to, will inevitably set a backlash among the others in the region. And you can see, I mean, China's quarrels with Japan and India, for example. But not everybody sees that China's rise in those negative terms that India sees or Japan sees today. For example, Kathmandu does not see it in the same way that Delhi does. But then Delhi and Kathmandu are not the only ones. Cambodia and Vietnam don't look at China's rise the same way. For Cambodia, the hegemon nearby, Vietnam, probably is seen as a bigger threat than China. For South Korea and Japan, they don't look at China's rise the same way. So I think there will be differences within Asia of how even to understand the implications of the current rise of Asia and within that China's rise. Third, that brings me to the last set of points, I mean, of Asia's rise and the West. That the othering of Asia and the West, I mean, has been a dominant theme from the beginning, from the time tensions time, all the Pan-Asian movements that emerged in this part of the world. But in retrospect, if you see Asia's rise, could it have been possible without collaboration with the West? Certainly, if you now look at the China's rise and India's own recent rise or ASEAN's growth, have not been independent of the West because they came out of a single integrated order in which Western capital, Western technology, Western access to Western markets played a big role in transforming Asia. And I think that's a fact, again, I think often not given credit for. And I think Asia's wars, interestingly, the Korean War beefed up Japanese capitalism, facilitated the rise of the Asian tigers. Vietnam War did much the same. And the economic integration after that did wonders for ASEAN and later for India and China. So therefore, this idea that somehow Asia's rise is going to be against the West, I think is problematic because for all the decline of the West, I mean, same time Okakura Tension published a book on Asia's rise, a man called Oswald Spengler wrote a book called The Decline of the West. Both these themes then are more than a century old. But the West is not disappeared. It's not going to disappear from Asia anytime. Any look at the numbers of cumulative investment in Southeast Asia, for example, US and the West are still very big dominant forces. They're still an important trade player. So therefore, this idea that these two are different worlds, are going to be different worlds, I think will be a mistake. So both these notions of the West as a political concept and Asia as a political concept, both are very fluid notions. And my sense is they are going to evolve in the years to come. And my sense is that the intersection between the two, that the internal contradictions within Asia are going to intersect with the emerging contradictions between US and China. How this plays out in different theaters of Asia, different countries, different capitals, I think it's going to be the most interesting phenomenon for all of us in this part of the world. So to conclude, I would say, don't get carried away with the notion of Asia's rise. triumphalism that's been associated with Asia's rise in the last couple of 3 decades, I think has run its course. And today we're going to see probably tragedy, some kinds of tragedies that will follow triumphalism of the recent past. And even more important, more complexity that we're going to see of the interaction within Asia and between Asia and the West. I think that is going to be the theme of our international relations in the years ahead. And there I would say this is going to leave all of us rather busy understanding and dealing with these profound changes that are taking place of a new relationship within Asia and between Asia and the West. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan, for highlighting 3 points, disaggregating Asia's rise, and of course, talking about Asian unity and how it is started and where we are in terms of the so-called unity, and then, of course, the Asian rise and the complexity that it has created within Asia and, of course, between Asia and the West. I think we have had a lot of inputs for really delving much more deeper into it in our next session. Now, I would like to invite Ambassador Tomasz Lukaszuk, a former police ambassador to this region and currently faculty, University of Warsaw. He's also associated with several institutions. He's well known for his writings in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Asia-Pacific issues, including on security-related issues. We'll be talking about realism versus neoliberal institutions in Asian security architecture, Indo-Pacific, and ASEAN. That's what I have been informed. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank Pramod for inviting me and congratulating NICE for this really great, gigantic, I think the biggest this year event on Asia and the Pacific, Indo-Pacific. Well, I'm speaking from Poland. It means the 5th biggest country of the European Union, and I feel obliged to tell you something about our perspective on rise of Asia. Because if I look at the leaflet of the conference, I can see that we are still in colonial time. You are still looking at Europe through London, through Washington. Where is Brussels? And Brussels is with the European Union, with NATO, is trying also, thanks to COVID time, thanks to time when you can think more deeply about the strategy, think about the changes you can make in your attitudes toward raising Asia. So what the European Union and NATO did this year and last year is change its attitude towards raising Asia. It means so far for the last 2-3 decades, we play soft power. We played, certainly except Afghanistan, but the European Union played soft power role. It's economy, technology, people to people, education, development aid for all the countries from South and Southeast Asia. Is facilitation of the integration, regional integration, especially the cooperation with ASEAN. So all those endeavors were focused on this very, very soft power. Nowadays, we are changing from this very neoliberal institutionalist approach to the realist approach when we are joining Indo-Pacific initiatives related to security. And last year, ASEAN and European Union, they became strategic partners in security. The defense, special defense envoy from the European Union was sent to Jakarta, to ASEAN Secretariat. This year, Indo-Pacific strategy was published by the European Union. the Indo-Pacific Indo-Pacific traces you also can find in the last NATO summit. So we are the Brussels, both European Union and NATO, is changing its attitude towards Asia, and certainly is a strategic dilemma for us. So how to deal? I mean, how to balance those two approaches? I mean, neoliberal institutionalist and realist. How to balance the old attitude with the new one? How to channel all our expectations and how to channel also all our dreams about the fostering the cooperation between European countries and rising Asia. It's important for Asia to see the significance of the institutions for us, because if all the rising Asia countries were still very much active in the United Nations, and for you, as it was mentioned by my predecessors, the United Nations is still considered as one of important instruments in global politics, and also it could play a very positive role for rising Asia. So I think that those European institutions should be also considered as important players. You should not in your foreign policy play like Forrest Gump, I mean, picking up the best chocolates from the box, the biggest partners only, and the middle powers like Poland and many others are considered as as non-important, I mean, first circle partners. And you have to remember that if you we are speaking about the foreign policy and the strategy, so and in economic terms, the strength of economy of the biggest Asian and European countries is based on middle and small entrepreneurs. Yes, this is the major strength of all the economies, because you have in all those economies you have more than 90% of companies registered small and medium size. So please remember about institutions, and please remember also about the middle power, because middle powers nowadays it's more about the liberal and neoliberal institutions than realism, because middle power is the country or organization like ASEAN, Indonesia, or to some extent also India. It's stick to the United Nations. It's really afraid of the rise of China, and at the same time it's trying to convince the United States that you have to talk to China and have a regular dialogue, and we can facilitate it as we did before. Thank you very much for today. I really feel privileged to speak to you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for highlighting the importance of Europe. Of course, that was the whole idea, that you are also participating here and then also contributing to it. And then also highlighting the recent Asia Indo-Pacific strategy of Europe, and also moving from institutional perspective to the realist perspective. And then, of course, the economic strength that Europe has, including the middle and the small industries who play a very important role. I think that's a very important contribution. We'll come back to many issues later on during the discussion, I'm sure. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan, is currently Director of the Center of Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation. She has been associated with various security-related international centers and UN group of experts. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And let me thank the organizers first for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to be part of this panel. In my remarks, I had discussed with Dr. Jaiswal that I'll be looking primarily at the Asian military spending as a reflection of the growing Asian insecurities. So many previous speakers have already mentioned as to how Asia is in a state of flux going through a geopolitical turn. Of course, the region has 4 of the world's emerging military powers: Russia, China, Japan, and India. It's also home to the 5 of the world's 9 nuclear powers, and some of the largest and fastest growing economies are in Asia, including Japan, China, South Korea, and India. But the fact that Asia still has several unresolved border and territorial issues and sovereignty issues continue to have a determining effect on the state of the major power relations in Asia. The current period of instability in both global and Asian affairs is dangerous. The reason for this instability lies, and of course, as the previous speakers highlighted, the transition of global power that is currently underway. Rise of China over the last two decades has been spectacular. Its rise is going to impact not just its neighbors in Asia, but the entire world. Great powers, of course, will always seek to dominate their neighborhoods and as much of the rest of the world as they can. There is nothing peculiarly Chinese about it, but one should not get carried away by the peaceful rise or the force for good rhetoric as well. Therefore, I would say that China's rise is likely to be as problematic, as tense and destabilizing as that of any other power. China's rise will be much like that of other great powers in the past, no more destabilizing, but certainly no less so. But China, like others said, is not the only rising power in Asia. The fact that there is a simultaneous rise of other powers in Asia, a marginal increase by India, a return of a normal nation in Japan, the return of the re-emergence of Russia, all of this is perceived by China as threatening. This comes from China's worldview and in very hierarchical terms as it pursues its hegemonic goals. It appears that as these Asian powers grow, there is a potential for an uncertain future with destabilizing consequences. The situation appears ripe for problems because of some of the inherent problems in the region, including unsettled boundary and territorial issues, baggage of history of countries having gone into war with each other, inherent distrust among the major powers, nationalism, as well as uncertainties about China's military modernization and its purpose. There is skepticism also as to how these powers will behave once they become more powerful and stronger. For a decade or more, scholars have written about how China will behave as it grows stronger, but it's always been clear that it will have significant impact on the region. Several reports talked about as to how China has become more powerful, economically more powerful, its options increase, from using coercive diplomacy to use of force to score diplomatic advantages, as well as in the resolution of border and territorial issues. And I think over the last few years, China's power has been in full display. One area that shows that Asia is on a precarious path is the growing defense spending, military spending in the region. According to the latest military balance, global defense spending for 2020 stood at $1.83 trillion, an increase by 3.9% in real terms. This is slightly lower than as compared to 2019. Global military expenditure as percentage of GDP went up from an average of 1.85% in 2019 to 2.08% in 2020. The military balance further said that the global economic output had been severely impacted by the pandemic, seeing a contraction of 4.4%. There are some variations in these numbers. If you look at the SIPRI figures, another mother of think tanks in a sense, for instance, the total global military expenditure rose to about $1,981 billion last year, an increase of 2.6% in real terms from 2019. The 5 biggest spenders in 2020, which together accounted for 62% of the global military expenditure, were the United States, China, India, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Military spending by China has been growing for the 26th consecutive year. Despite the economic slowdown imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, military spending has been maintained almost at the same level as the previous year. This at least partly illustrates the growing security competition that's clearly feeding the military spending. It's unlikely that this trend will reverse in the near term because there is no guarantee that the security environment in the Indo-Pacific will ease up anytime soon. About 2/3 of the total hike of 4% global military expenditure was contributed to by the increase in defense expenditure by the US and China. The US defense budget saw a hike of 6.3% in 2020 in real terms, and China saw a slight reduction from 5.9% in 2019 to 5.2% in 2020. The global defense expenditure could see a slowdown in 2021 with the US defense spending set to flatten, and the Asia-Pacific region is also likely to witness a decline on account of the economic impact of the COVID-19. The Indo-Pacific region, other than China, also saw a reduced growth in defense spending, declining from 3.8, a marginal decline from 3.8 to 3.6%. But given the size of the Chinese economy, for instance, the effect of China's slowdown has been marginal. In fact, the military balance points out that the China's defense spending hike in 2020, despite the slowdown at $12 billion, was still way higher than the combined defense budget increases in all the other Asian states. Russia's military expenditure, meanwhile, has also gone up, increased by 2.5% in 2020 to reach about $61.7 billion. This was the second consecutive year of growth. Nevertheless, Russia's actual military spending in 2020 was 6.6% lower than its initial military budget, a larger shortfall in the than in previous years. So how do you explain the growing military expenditure in the Indo-Pacific? Japan, for instance, has approved a record defense expenditure of 5.3 trillion yen, which amounts to about $51.7 billion for 2021. The approved budget saw a hike of 0.5% from the allocation of 2020. Japan's defense budget has seen the hike for 9 years now continuously, primarily on account of regional threats, including China and North Korea. China's assertive behavior, especially in the maritime domain, as well as North Korea's nuclear and missile threats, have been cited as important rationale for the continued hike in defense spending. Tokyo has also assigned funding for some of the unconventional and non-conventional areas like outer space, cyber, electromagnetic warfare, all of which have been a focus area for the People's Liberation Army, especially after the establishment of the PLA Strategic Support Force. In similar vein, India too has increased its defense spending in 2021-22. In the budget announced in February this year, the defense budget allocation saw a marginal hike of 1.4% from 4.71 trillion Indian rupees to about 4.78 trillion rupees in 21-22. In spite of the small hike, what was more significant was the allocation for capital spending at nearly 18.8%. This is particularly significant because the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been significant, but it clearly shows the government's priorities for the Indian defense sector in the face of the China threat, especially in the backdrop of the Galwan clash. Australia, another critical Indo-Pacific power, has also hiked its defense spending. In spite, again, of the pandemic effect, Australia is estimated to be spending about Australian dollar $42.75 billion, which is about 2.19% of the GDP. Reports indicate that this trend is to continue to reach up to about 2.3% of GDP by 2023-2024. So along with Japan and India, Australia too has been at the receiving end of China's muscular policies, including trade and economic cohesion, which has been now an increasing rationale for these countries to increase their defense spending. In Southeast Asia as well, the smaller powers are beginning to increase their military expenditure, Vietnam being one case in point, Singapore is another one. Other countries such as, again, Philippines and Indonesia have also been increasing their defense spending. In Northeast Asia, South Korea has stepped up its defense spending as well. So all in all, you have seen a growth in the military spending. And SIPRI data, for instance, also shows very similar trends. In fact, they assert the fact that Asian military spending has been going up since 1989, possibly as a consequence of the increasing wealth in the region. So given the changing balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, as well as China's aggressive behavior and the military aggressive posturing and belligerent behavior, this trend is likely to continue as for the foreseeable future. In fact, China's aggressive posturing, continuing air and naval intrusions into each of the smaller neighbors in the neighborhood, continue to be a worrying development, which will only accelerate the pace of military spending in the Indo-Pacific. There is also the life cycle-driven military modernization that's taking place. So this is also an important aspect of as to why you see an increased military spending in the region. While the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic could be severe for countries like India, the security compulsions will continue to be a major imperative for Indian budget allocation, as well as for many other countries in the region. Like I said, countries like India, Japan have felt the pinch with their economies shrinking very badly, but at the same time, the security imperatives facing Tokyo, New Delhi, Canberra, and others in Southeast Asia, they are also very real. So these two opposing trends will decide where the Asian defense spending will go in the next couple of years. On the one hand, the pandemic will put pressure on defense budgets. On the other hand, the increasing insecurity and tension could provide further incentives for the budgets to grow. So which of these trends will dominate is difficult to predict, but it will depend on the amount of damage that the pandemic will do to each of these national economies and the level of insecurity that China will foist on the region by its attempt to use pandemic as an opportunity to expand. So unfortunately, this trend of increased military spending will continue. And with that comes the tendency to use of force and the tendency to find military solutions, which will only further accentuate the Asian insecurities. But the growing Asian insecurities have also given way for some interesting partnerships. The internal capacity deficit on the part of many countries, as well as the greater convergence of strategic interests among a number of Indo-Pacific countries, have brought military and security partnerships among an unusual number of partners like the Quad, for instance. For India, at least it was not the go-to comfort partner for a long time, but driven by the rapidly changing security dynamics, the Quad has become a viable option for India. Any number of multilaterals collaborating on security and strategic issues is a result of the Asian insecurities, and that's going to be an increasing feature. So let me stop there, and I'll be happy to hear your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raji, for highlighting the military dimension of it, and especially the growing defense spending in Asia, but also fueling insecurity in the region. And then, of course, the economic strength, despite the fact that they have to also face the COVID-19 related, the challenges impacting on the economy. But again, because of the insecurity, the military spending is increasing. I think that's, thank you for your observation. Now I would like to invite Dr. Stefan Nagy, who is a senior associate professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies, International Christian University in Tokyo. He's a distinguished fellow at various centers and institutes. His areas of work include China and Japan and interrelationship among the middle powers in the Asia-Pacific region. He's talking about rising Asia opportunities and challenges that will shape the region's evolution. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and my warmest congratulations to Nice for hosting such a meaningful and timely conclave. I'd like to thank Pramod for the invitation, of course, the Ambassador for chairing, and our co-panelists for such an interesting and stimulating discussion. I'd like to springboard off Ambassador Menon's point about between orders, and as well borrow from Professor Mohan's points about the trajectory of Asia or Indo-Pacific, or however we want to define the region, is not necessarily linear. And in my opening discussions or my points today, I'd like to talk about opportunities within the region that are going to frame its development. I'd like to talk about challenges that I think will create questions of the direction of the region. And I'd like to perhaps be provocative and raise a question at the end of my discussion of what it actually means for China to become a country or a civilization of 1 billion urbanized people. And I really encourage you to think about this. What does it mean in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of the identity that China will have? What does it mean when we pack 1 billion people into an ultra urbanized environment, and how will this translate into regional relations? So when I'm thinking about the topic of this panel in terms of the rise of Asia, of course, the opportunities are plentiful. It is home to the most significant trade agreements, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as well as the Comprehensive, Progressive, and Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are different kinds of trading agreements, but they're critical because they bring Southeast Asia, South Asia, and countries in the Indo-Pacific broadly together to engage in trade. This means that the region will be economically dynamic, will be economically relevant, and critical to shaping future trade rules, in particular on intellectual property rights, on environmental law, labor law, and the role of state-owned enterprises moving forward. These are opportunities for the region to be a critical leader in helping itself develop, but also in forging trade moving forward. It's also home to, I think, two really critical regionalization initiatives. The Belt Road Initiative, that's of course out of China, that aims to, I think, really shift the regionalization process that we've watched over the past 40 years from a north to south perspective, linking Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia, to one that really moves from Eastern China through the West, through South Central Asia, through South Asia, and perhaps all the way to the Middle East and Africa. What does this mean for economic regionalism? What does it mean for rule setting? What does it mean for economic dynamism? These are important questions that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the rise of Asia. There's also a few other initiatives that I think are huge opportunities for this region. The September 2020 Regional Supply Chain Initiative that came from the trilateral cooperation between India, Japan, and Australia. This has real implications for shifting and selectively diversifying supply chains out of China through Southeast Asia and South Asia. Again, this presents opportunities for the region. It presents opportunities for development, and it presents opportunities for fundamentally changing the nature of the global economy. Lastly, in terms of opportunity, of course, is the middle classes. The region will be home to emerging middle classes, those emerging consumers that will drive economic growth, drive demand. And I think that this will be important in how we think about consumption, important how we think about development, important how we think about innovation. These will be driving features of Asia's rise. But these driving features of Asia's rise will also come with many challenges. And here I think that Dr. Raji's very granular look at military spending is very important to be thinking about. But I think that military spending was going to be shaped by the challenges moving forward. In particular, non-traditional security challenges are a heavy burden within this region. Climate change. We've already felt the effects of climate change in terms of rising sea levels. Rising sea levels were going to affect the bread baskets or the rice baskets of the region. Think about the Mekong Delta or the Bangladesh and the low sea level areas of India. How will these regions be shaped by climate change? And this is inevitable. It's not something that we can stop. It's something that's going to cause huge shifts in populations. It's going to cause destabilization, and it's going to cause a shift in our local climates. Transnational diseases that as we've seen with the COVID-19 crisis, has fundamentally negatively affected both the formal and, importantly, the informal economies throughout the region. The formal economies have had support from governments. They've had support from institutions, but the informal economies, of course, have been devastated by the transnational disease of COVID-19. This is going to be important areas and important challenges for us moving forward and thinking about Asia's rise. How well are we going to be able to manage the informal economies? And I've been to Nepal many times, and many of the other countries within the region. That informal sector is so critical to the ordinary prosperity of ordinary Nepalese or Indians or Southeast Asians. We also need to think about pollution. Of course, China's drive to develop, but also India's drive to develop, and Pakistan and others. Pollution has had a heavy toll on the region. How will this impact their economies moving forward? Will they be able to springboard into a green economy? And how will this affect the region's rise? Are open questions for us to be thinking about. I mentioned the informal economy in terms of being the real victim of COVID-19. These are huge challenges to be thinking about emerging countries within Asia, however we define the boundaries. Will the informal economies be able to transition the way China has managed to transition much of its informal economies? Again, these are open questions because they're related to the quality of institutions we have, the quality of governance we have, and not necessarily to the kind of government we have. China has done a tremendous job in terms of the informal economies, where we've seen democratic countries, whether it's India or others, as many have said, they've paid for their democracy with their development. Dealing with the informal economy is going to be critical to thinking about the trajectory of Asia's rise. Lastly, and definitely not leastly, is of course the population challenges within the region. Northeast Asia is plagued by a graying population. China has just shifted its child policy to allow Chinese to have 3 policies. The chatter on the Chinese internet is almost universally negative. Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, of course, are all facing a very serious graying population. How they manage this graying population, how will they pay for social welfare programs moving forward? How will they keep those economies being dynamic moving forward? Not just in terms of economic growth, but the ideas that are generated from the youth. But when we pivot to Southeast Asia and we pivot to South Asia, they have the reverse problem. Too many young people and not enough good quality jobs. This creates challenges in terms of moving through improving economic development and of course achieving middle income status. When there's too many people and not enough jobs, incomes are suppressed. When incomes are suppressed, we can't educate our public as well. We can't boost overall development. Again, these are challenges that are going to require stronger institutions and better governance. Are we able to move forward in this region? That's an open question for us to be thinking about. My last, I guess, a comment that I'd like to bookend into this discussion is really the inevitability of China's rise. I mentioned this opening question. What does it mean for us to have a society of 1 billion urbanized people? Will the environment be able to sustain that kind of consumption and that kind of development? These are important questions for China to think about, but also all of the developing countries within the region, whether it's India, Southeast Asia. These countries, as they develop their economies, are going to have to think very creatively how to manage development. And I'm not primarily, I focus more on, again, security issues. But when I think about the future and I think about these critical questions of what does it mean for a society as big as China to be urbanized? What does it mean in terms of the identity, and how will that identity be directed at the region? And in terms of prioritizing development and prioritizing cooperation and acquiring the resources that it needs to maintain that urbanized society, this leads me to many uncomfortable conclusions that we may have a rather unstable China rather than a stable China. And unstable China really leads us to questions about what is the future order of the region? And again, going back to Ambassador Menon's comments, are we in between orders? I would say we definitely are, but what comes after between orders may actually be disorder. And disorder means not the rise of Asia, but perhaps more disorder within the region, challenges within the region, and the importance, as Ambassador Lukaszuk mentioned, of outside actors and bringing stability to the region, whether that's the EU, Japan, or the United States, or where I'm from, Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Nagy, for highlighting non-military security challenges, of course, dealing with the issues related to population, industrialization of 1 billion people, and then linking that with the many other issues related to the political and security challenges, and of course, the other non-military challenges like climate change and the pandemic. So thank you very much for all your presentation. Now we are in the discussion mode. I think there are also, I see some of the questions which have also come up in our chat box. We will definitely take them up as far as practical and as far as possible. But I would like to, just again, try to go a little bit deeper into some of the points that the presenters have already made. Yes, Muni, Professor, you mentioned that, when we talk about Asia, it has to be multipolar and it has to be consensual and it has to be follow norms. Now, how do we really make sure that, there has been a lot of talk about this global order, the international norms, and there are also practical international norms which we have developed over the last 5 centuries, especially after the Second World War. but how do we really take that forward in the Asian context? What are the things that we need to really look at in terms of ensuring that these norms are really followed? Because there is no Asian structure as such. So what would be the mechanism of really taking forward these multipolar Asian, world following norms? And that is one of the issues that perhaps we should be also looking at a little bit deeper. And of course, Shivshankar Menon, you talked about South Asia being at the focus of this whole new, the context in Asia, and the rise of, the whole of Asia. And there is also a lot of interest from not only China, but of course, United States and Europe as well, I must say, because that was also one of the issues that was brought by one of our, presenters, the ambassador, Tomasz Lukaszuk. So how do you see, because, some of the things that we are talking about in terms of the South Asian challenges, especially from the smaller countries like Nepal and others, that we would really like to see that we have a best of relationship with all, China, India, and the West. And it doesn't have to be, the zero-sum game. It can be a positive-sum game, and we would like to really make sure that it moves towards that direction. But how do you really see going forward in terms of handling all these, the relationship, the dimensional relationship coming from all the countries around the world towards this particular region? And then, of course, the dynamics, especially, between India and China, especially after Galwan Valley, there has been a lot of, the Indo-China relationship has really gone through a very now complex stage. But how do you see that going forward so that other countries will also find a way to really engage, all the major powers in order to move forward? I think that is partly related to what, the Raja Mohan was also talking about. When you talk about Asia, the rise of Asia, it is always interlinked with what we had cooperation with the Western world, and we live in a really interdependent and interconnected world. I think that really strikes into our own thinking as well, that, if we really want to grow in this interdependent and globalized world, how to really minimize the conflicting, the issues, and then, of course, how to really maximize those collaborative efforts is something that we will be looking at. So we would like to really see how, we can move forward. Again, Raja Mohan, you can maybe elaborate a little bit further on some of the issues that you talked about. Is the Asian unity possible? Because there is so many, types of, the Asian civilizations here, so many levels of different economic, I should say, the economic strength, and the, the vulnerable countries like small countries and those which are very least contributive, the components of power. How do they really manage to see that when there is a rise of all the boats, the smaller boats also get lifted? And how do you really see that being played out in Asia? And then, of course, Madam, you can also really think about how that would be really impacting the smaller countries. If there is more of the expenditure on the Asian, the security, how this is going to affect the other economic development as well as the, the growth prospect. And of course, the Europe, I think it is very important for us. We looked at the recent Indo-Pacific strategy from Europe. That is a very important document. It has really tried to encompass all the issues from human rights to development to technology to the freedom of navigation to all of that. But again, it also talks about a strategic autonomy in terms of the role of Europe, going forward. And how do you really see the Europe really moving when there is so much of a competitive, approach to all the issues, whether it is a trade, whether it's a technology, whether it is about human rights issues and all of that. How do you see that, moving forward? So these are some of the questions, but there will be also other, the points that you would like to raise. Please go ahead. And maybe I will read one or two points so that you can also, reply to some of the questions that I see in the chat box. There is a direct question to Professor Menon. It says the growing rivalry of China with India in regional level, at a regional level, and with US at the global level. To what extent do we believe that we are following basically the Europe's past Is that Asia's future? Can Asian civilization value can be helpful to prevent such thesis? This is one particular question. And then also to Professor Raja Mohan, sir, how the religious polarization, West Asia and elsewhere, and authoritarianism versus democracy is going to be played out in uniting or dividing the Asian countries in future. And there is also one more, while we talk about the rise of Asia, are we also thinking Occidentalism versus Orientalism? How would the socio-cultural aspect play out in the rise of Asia vis-a-vis the West? These are general questions. So that you may also take up, and then we'll see if we have time, we'll take up other issues as well. Please, can I start with Professor Muni again? Maybe follow the same order if you like.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the question which you have raised. I accept that when I talk about multipolar Asia, it is more of a concept and a vision, and we are nowhere very close to the reality. But when we talk of multipolar Asia, there is a strong message which is being given on the one hand to China and on the other hand to the US. In this message, the underlying aspect is that nobody should be able to dominate Asia as it is. It is just not possible really to dominate now in the present context. I link it up with what Raja has been asking about India and the the Asian and the West coming together. We must pay compliments to the Chinese for facilitating it in a very great extent. And don't forget, when we are analyzing this aspect, don't forget that West is very keen still to restore and consolidate its hegemony in Asia, West in particular, in general, and US in particular. And I would draw your attention to the last weeks, or I think maybe 10 days, the US NATO declaration, in which NATO has declared that China is a global threat. Now, don't forget, Europe was very hesitant in clubbing itself with the US so far as China was concerned, and they wanted to have a freer engagement. They still probably would want to have freer engagement. But the fact that NATO has said that is due to the efforts of the US. The US in Asia, in Indo-Pacific region, has redefined its traditional alliance relationships with Australia, with Japan, with Korea, and it has built up new associations. I don't call it alliance, but in terms of partnership with countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia to a very large extent. And that is largely to share burden of containing China, meaning thereby restoring and consolidating the US hegemony. Have no mistake about it. Therefore, message has to go to the US that please don't think on the line of restoring hegemony. Don't use the divisions which are there. Here again, I agree that Asia has differentiated growth it is. And as you also said, sir, Mr. Acharya, others have said that there is a lot of diversity in Asia. But diversity and differentiation, and I underline it, is not necessarily divisive. It can be made divisive, it can be exploited divisive, because we all live in diversity. And I think human civilization has shown tremendous innovative capacity to harmonize diversity. Therefore, diversity is not a problem. Differentiation is also not a problem. The problem is the question of thinking in terms of domination. So multipolar Asia is a message, I would say, to both US and China, that this is what we want to govern ourselves, all of us together. Now, as you said rightly, there is no existing structure, but I said ASEAN can be a model. And therefore, I'll take you to the East Asia Summit, which is a conglomeration of most of the Asia-Pacific major players. And I think you can draw broad values and norms, and everybody should accept that. That is what multipolar Asia would be, whether in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of territorial assertions, in terms of cultural domination, radicalization, terrorism, anything. let us have broad norms with which we would want to be governed, brought out as a consensus in some of these meetings like the East Asia Summit, or you can create a new forum, call it Indo-Pacific Council or Indo-Pacific Forum or whatever else it is. So that's not the problem. The forum is not a problem. Intent is problem. If the intent is not to live together in harmony, then none of the forums would ever help. So that's what I meant by what you call the multipolar Asia, which means we must do something in which the conflict is set aside and consensus is evolved and implemented and those norms are followed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, the intent is important, but the forum could be always created. That's very good. Thank you very much. Now the Professor Menon. Shivshankar Menon.
Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You asked me basically two questions. I mean, how does South Asia, with its rising significance, avoid this zero-sum choice that who is offering us a zero-sum choice? Only those powers who feel that they can create a system in Asia that is centered on themselves. I mean, you know, this argument, but frankly, that's not how Asia is. If we say that Asia is diverse, that Asia has followed separate paths and has managed to live with diversity, it's a plural Asia. Throughout history, what were we? We were separate multiverses which traded, exchanged ideas, people, religions, everything. But we didn't get into each other's politics and security. And that, I think, is the key. If there is, as Professor Muni said, a willingness to deal, to draw limits on your own ambition and to accommodate other people's reasonable political and security interests, then I think it's possible to live with what he called a multipolar Asia. And I think we will be going there. I don't think South Asia is central to Asian geopolitics anymore. And I think that's just as well, frankly. Those who have been central to global geopolitics have not done very well. I mean, Germany stunted, Germany divided, you know, this is not the place to be. We are very close to the central fault line, and that's our problem. But for me, the answer is actually to stick to what we are good at, which is working with everyone, keeping it open, but most important, concentrating on our own material strengths, material well-being, on our economies, on running our own affairs well. Because the worse we run our own affairs, the more chance there is for others to actually start interfering and dragging you into their quarrels. So for me, that's the way to handle the multi-directional relationships. What does the present dynamic, or what I have called the crisis in India-China relations, portend for everyone else nearby, especially? My own sense is, frankly, if you look at what both the governments have been saying and doing, they have tried very hard to keep this below the level of an actual conflict. In fact, what they are saying about each other, they're talking to each other, what they are projecting is much better than what you see in all the commentaries. You know, what is the actual reality is a completely different, but why are they projecting this? Because I think they both see the need to find a way forward to a new equilibrium between India and China. And they're in the process of finding that. Will they succeed or not? I don't know. But frankly, that is something both show the will to do. So I would not bet on this crisis going on forever in the present shape. I do believe that India and China between themselves are clever enough to actually manage this situation and to move forward. It may not be what we are used to before. In fact, it will not be. There's no going back. But there will be a new equilibrium which develops. And from an Indian point of view, that's an equilibrium which should work with the neighborhood first, and then with everybody else. But it's a complicated thing. Right now, I think we're bang in the middle of it, and it's very difficult to make predictions. Somebody asked, is Europe's past Asia's future? I certainly hope not. And I do not think it is. Why do I hope not? What is Europe's past? 400 years of war, 2 world wars, leading all the way up to 2 world wars, which destroyed Europe's power and actually created 2 others, European superpowers on their flanks, but destroyed Europe's own power. That's not the path we want to go. I mean, you know, everyone says, oh, France and Germany made peace. Yeah, but only after 400 years of war and after devastation, some wars which actually killed, you know, almost 1/3 of the population of some countries. No, thank you. Europe's past, we don't want. Where are we going? And I don't think we will go that way at all, because Asia is different. The geography is different. History is different. The balance of power is different. And unlike Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, the difference in power, as Raja pointed out, between China, which is 3 times bigger than the next largest economy, Japan, the difference in power is considerable. So there will be a hierarchy of power, whether you like it or not. I mean, it might not suit everybody's egos, but there will be a hierarchy of power which is much more distinct than what Europe had. It was the contention, the struggle for mastery in Europe between powers of almost equal, who thought they were equal in power, that actually led to this disastrous end result that we saw in the last century, and a whole century, as I said, centuries of war. So to my mind, the economic states, the existing hierarchy of power, geography, all these, I mean, the Indian Ocean is an open geography. This is not a battle space like the Mediterranean or the Black Sea. So I have a whole host of reasons to think that we will not go Europe's way. Thank God.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very positive, the approach to it. I would now give the floor to Professor Raja Mohan.
Thank you. I think a number of questions, and I think the one you posed on, I think one of the things I was trying to do is to look, if we don't shed our myths about Asia, we're not going to go anywhere. I think it's important to constantly question the mythology that we've constructed for ourselves. I think, which is, for example, you can have Asia, okay, you can draw a line from Istanbul, or you want to go further to Egypt. There was Egypt in the Bandung Conference, there was Sudan in the Bandung Conference. You can draw any amount of sphere. So I think we should really, for a moment, please forget West Asia. And nobody in West Asia uses the term West Asia. They call themselves Middle East. So let's not construct something which is not there and say, look, so today when we talk about debate of Asia, right, it's largely about East Asia. Today South Asia is going to be part of it because of the closeness of South Asia to that. Rather than, so I think best is to be more narrow in the way we debate things rather than frame this in this sweeping terms. I think the problem of unity, I think, which I tried to say, look, there was never Asian unity. As I said, look, it was an idea. It's a great idea, but it was elusive in reality. So for example, throughout history, I think the Japanese wanted to construct Asian unity on the basis of a co-prosperity sphere. So when a rising power uses it, it is seen as hegemonic. Look, they were trying to use it, and the first one to dismiss it was China. When Russia proposed Asians' collective security proposal for Asia, 69, Comrade Brezhnev, China was the first one to reject it. Today, when China says Asia for Asians, I don't think the Indians will have a big smirk on their face. So I think, look, I think time we at least must not be this, debating these things like innocent, taking words on their own face value, rather than it's an international forum. I think we should be more analytical with these concepts. The ASEAN itself today, I think the ASEAN last 20 years, end of the Cold War to 2008, you can say, was a phase in which there was no great power rivalry, there was full support for globalization, when it looked like ASEAN-centered platform is going to create a basis for everyone to get together. We're still talking about East Asia, including India, that we can construct a forum for discussing security issues and dealing with regional economic integration through trade. India walked out of ASEAN. You can judge that decision, but the fact is, India was not willing to be part of a China-centered economic system. So I think let's not get carried away with this notion of unity. I think all of us, you have to deal with the reality. While you need big ideas, transformative ideas, that daily you have to deal with the contradictions that present. Today ASEAN itself is divided. And many in ASEAN worry about the Quad, which they think complicates their central position in the region. So there are new debates that are already unfolding, and I think that they're going to be with us in many ways. Look at this idea, China itself. They had an alliance with the Soviet Union in the 50s. He fought a war with the Americans in 50 to 53 in the Korean War. Mao Zedong's own son died in that war. Barely 15 years later, he's negotiating with America for a new arrangement. So I think anyone who thinks these big ideas are going to drive policy, someone was asking about democracy versus, authoritarianism, religion, just look at those two concepts. I mean, when did democracy was the central theme for running foreign policies? For the West, let's ask that question. If democracy was the main objective in the Cold War, Pakistan won't be their ally and India won't be their adversary during the Cold War. Or China and US were closer than India and the US were during the Cold War. So I think there is going to be this nice constructs within which the real politics will play itself out. And I think for us, it is important to see those forces rather than get dragged into it. That we can leave it to the politicians, but as here, I presume we're all scholars of international relations. We have to take a closer look. Those issues are not going to go away, but I think in real world, interests are going to matter a lot more. Take Islam. Just as Pan-Asianism rose, Pan-Islamism was a powerful force. But if it had succeeded, we would be in a different Middle East today. Let's take the China question. What's happening in Xinjiang? Do you think OIC passes a resolution against China? That tells you the real politics of China's role today, its power as an economic. Pakistan, which takes up Kashmir all the time, is not going to raise the question of what's happening in Xinjiang in OIC. I'm not saying it's their sovereign right to do what they want, but let's see through this, that it's interests that matter, not this superstructure, if you will, of ideologies that are imposed on it for political mobilization, for convenience, etc. But at the end of it, it's really the national interest. Finally, one question Ambassador Acharya posed, what about India, China getting together to save the world kind of stuff? I mean, look, I don't see, again, I think the history of India-China relations, I pointed to 1927. Nehru himself was there in the Brussels Congress. Within 10 years, we were on different sides. 50s, India was the only one. Today, a lot of people are blaming Kissinger for going to the US. India was serenading China in the 50s. But then we ended up in 62. And then we was accused as being pro-Soviet by the Chinese, while Chinese had an alliance with the Russians in the 50s. Then we became the Soviet lackeys in this part of the world. And then when we make up with the Americans, now Chinese are going ballistic and saying, look, how can India be close to the Americans when they had a much stronger, much deeper, more intensive strategic and economic relationship with China. So I think, again, I think we need to, with Ambassador Menon, and I'm not going to say too much on India, look, we need to live like neighbors. If we can achieve that, that will be a tremendous achievement for peace and stability in the world, rather than thinking, look, we're going to join hands and deal with the West, we're going to have this alternative world order. But that is the delusion of the last 100 years. I mean, we're not there, 27 will be 100, but I think we need to temper that down, be practical, do modest things where we don't fight with each other, and we can resolve our tensions, which are going to be more and more in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, in Asia. So that itself will be a great contribution, rather than this jumping from an extraordinary conflictual situation to sweeping judgments of what we can do in the world, which has been part of a problem in South Asia, I think, of foreign policy discourse. But hopefully there'll be more realism as we look ahead.
Thank you very much. Now, Madam Raji.
Thank you. Thank you for that interesting question on, I think, how does the increased military spending really justify or will it affect the sort of developmental agenda? And I think this is not entirely a new argument. I think this can, India can go back to, or even the region can go back to and see the whole bread versus gun argument. And but the reality is that India, as well as many other countries in the region, don't have the luxury of ignoring some of the security compulsions. These have been forced upon these countries. So in a sense, ignoring the security imperatives will have its own cost in a sense. So I think these countries are going to have to walk a very fine balancing between their development agenda and the growing security requirements. And I think this is precisely one of the reasons why there is an effort to form coalitions of countries coming together to do some sort of burden sharing and so on and so forth. It's not going to be easy, but I think there are, precisely because there are limited resources available for military spending or the security kind of pursuing the security agenda, that like-minded countries are coming together to work on a number of different issues, both within the security, pursuing the security agenda, but also engaging in larger infrastructure connectivity projects, and a number of different kind of functions are becoming prominent among sort of several groupings of the smaller like-minded countries. And I think that's going to be a trend. There was also one specific question on the US attitude towards China. Let me take that as well. So I think there was considerable apprehension before the Biden administration took office as to how the US policy towards China is going to be shaped like, and what is it going to look like in a sense. But I think ever since the Biden administration came into office, President Biden took office, I think there has been a greater amount of clarity, sense of clarity on how they want to go about, while the US still seeks to work with China where possible in terms of some of the global issues, collaborating on some of the global issues, whether it's climate change and so on and so forth. But I think the overall framework that is shaping the relationship between India, between the US and China today is one of strategic competition. And I think that's become very clear as well in the manner in which the US is pursuing some of the other agenda. For the first time, you had the Quad Summit meeting right after the Biden administration came into office. So that's also an indicator of how things are going to shape up. Just one quick point I want to make about the whole, the lack of institutionalism in the region as a problem in a sense. I agree. And I think that's been one of the problems since then, the lack of institutional mechanisms, an overarching institutional mechanism in Asia has been a problem. Similarly, and I think there, I am entirely with Dr. Mohan when he says that you can look at ASEAN, but ASEAN is not going to work, has not been working. The absence of an the minute you brought in the sovereignty related issues, territorial issues, and so on and so forth, those conflicts into the ASEAN thing, you did see how fractured the ASEAN became in a sense. So ASEAN was a sort of an example to look at for other countries, as long as it was as more of an economic cooperative institution. But the minute you brought in some of the trickier issues, sovereignty and political conflicts and kind of thing, it has shown that it is a divided house. So that's going to be a problem. But I think that's where also the whole economic dependency and the trade brings peace theory has not really worked. And if that was the case, China and Japan should have been the best of friends, or in the case of India and China. So I think there are a lot of limitations, institutional mechanism being one, but I think trade brings peace theory is not working because nationalism has proven to be a much bigger imperative, much bigger factor impacting on the kind of relations that we see play out in Asia. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Tomasz, Lukaszuk, can you?
Thank you, Raj, Mr. Chair. Thank you much for, first of all, for your reference to interdependence. So it means the neoliberal institution is still alive. But I will not agree with that the institutional framework is not alive in Asia. I do not agree with the critics of ASEAN because what ASEAN actually, it was also mentioned by Professor Raja Mohan and Stephen Nagy, that the centrality of ASEAN is a really very important element, not only for today, but for the future of institutional security framework in the Pacific. And I would see the Quad and the Quad Summit is only, let's say, incipient element, and this is only this very small contribution, because what ASEAN created, I mean, all the institutional engagements for China, for dialogue partners, and the Shangri-La dialogue and ARRF and many others, it exists, and this institutional framework is very important for all the countries. Not speaking about the dialogue of the defense ministers, ADM++ and so on. So I do not agree that there is a lack of institutional framework. And for Nepal, you have headquarters of important international institution in your capital city. So you have to use it and you have to utilize it in a more energetic way, because I know that it's difficult just being between two whales, I mean, Pakistan and India, but you can use it in a good way, and you can do it like Korea is trying to tune the US politics in Korean Peninsula. I mean, not to make it too realistic, not to make it too coercive, and you can do the same. Speaking about the channels for the future of the cooperation between Europe and Asia, I would say that another important institution headquarters is in Singapore. I mean, ASEF and ASEAN, Asia Europe Meeting and Asia Europe Foundation. We totally, I mean, I was representative of Poland to that institution. I can tell you that, but what we do, we just misuse this channel of cooperation. And because we made it the second General Assembly of the United Nations. And what we should do, we should focus on coordinating and organizing the infrastructure cooperation, like you know, China did it. I mean, not in the style of China, but I'm speaking about infrastructure facilitation and the economic cooperation, the transfer of technology, environmental issues, and so on, so on. So this we should focus on, not on the overall issues of the United Nations, what we did and we still are doing on ASEAN forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to Dr. Stephen Nagy.
You didn't raise a question, so I'll let you raise a question and then I will comment.
There was no, okay. I think you were focusing on, of course, the non-military, the security issues, especially the industrialization of 1 billion people, as well as the pandemic and other issues. Now, I mean, how do you really look at, what is the ways and means to really deal with that? I mean, you said that will create a huge problem, but then how do you avoid, creating this huge environmental as well as other challenges for countries like China, but perhaps that is also applicable to other countries in maybe a couple of decades time. So what is your suggestion to really move forward? I mean, can you really say countries not to industrialize themselves, or how do really they transition themselves to the greener economy, if you like? I mean, is there any thoughts on that?
So I think that I believe it was Professor Mohan mentioned Japan as being the leader of development and modernization within the region, and it was followed by the newly industrialized economies and followed by China. And I think one of the commonalities of these countries overcoming the developmental challenges is they started to build strong institutions. They focused on good governance and arguably less of a focus on the kind of whether it was democratic or not. And when we pivot to Southeast Asia and we pivot to South Asia, I think that these regions are challenged institutionally in terms of good governance. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that quite significantly, that they weren't able to manage these issues very well. And there's really huge questions if they can come out of the pandemic without outside help. And frankly, that these challenges of lack of strong institutions and good governance is going to be creates challenges in dealing with many developmental challenges, whether it's population issues, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's urbanization. Here, countries like China, Japan, and South Korea are well positioned because they have stronger institutions and governance. So in that sense, I think that the way out will be to strengthen institutions and to strengthen good governance in many parts of the region, finding local solutions, but again, based on strong institutions that create sustainable results in terms of development. I think there's no magic solution, that there is many challenges within this region that really I'm not sure if they can be solved. And as I mentioned, I think that they will very much inform how Asia rises, and will probably result in a very uneven rise of Asia. We already see that uneven rise of Asia today. Moving forward, the first mover advantage in terms of strong institutions and governance will give position those countries in a better place to deal with their challenges. The late movers will be in a much more precarious position in terms of dealing with their domestic challenges. And I think that this will, in many ways, be a hurdle in terms of thinking about Asia's rise in a more balanced, equitable, and sustainable manner.
Thank you very much. I think we have had a very good discussions. I think we are coming to a very, the close of our session. I must say that we have had a very rich discussion, very diverse, the issues that we took up, but again, tried to find some commonalities, although of course, in discussions like that, we cannot find a solution to a big problem that the Asia as a whole faces. But I would say that, Asia is perhaps a microcosm of the world. Therefore, if you can deal with Asia, perhaps it can also give a lesson to the world how to really deal with the issues. And for countries like Nepal, I think we also like to really stress that the cooperative world order is really stressed. We believe that, having a cooperative world order in the neighborhood as well as in the larger Asia will be a very important contributor to promote the overall, growth as well as ensure our prosperity. I think that is also equally what we would like to see, happening in the Asian region, and the management of, I think, the conflict, especially the peaceful settlement of disputes, will be very, very important for us. The collaborative, the relationship between India and China will be a plus point for us. We always believe that that will have a positive impact on us, and of course to the whole region as a whole. And I believe that when we talk about the forthcoming Asian order, perhaps all the countries and the rise of Asia, quote unquote Asia, how do you really define that? Asia is an issue that the smaller countries with limited attributes of power will also have a voice and representation, and they will be also able to grow in this Asian prosperity, if you like, coming forward. But we do know that there are many challenges, especially the contest between the major powers within as well as powers, China and US, are sharpening. And I hope that all the countries that we talk about, cooperative order, Pacific, the settlement of disputes, and then maybe perhaps confidence building measures that we promote should enhance even the collaborative, the relationship between the established power like United States and the emerging power like China. And that will have a very important ramification, not only in Asia, perhaps in the whole of the world. So I think this has been a very wonderful, the discussion. So I would like to once again thank all our distinguished speakers, as well as the participants through the wave. And I thank you all for participating in this particular program. I will now give back the microphone to the organizers.
Distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.